This presentation is provided by BoardPack LLC for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. The opinions expressed by the presenters are their own and not necessarily those of BoardPack. On behalf of BoardPack, we welcome you to today's webinar. BoardPack has teamed up with Amazon's #1 best-selling author in board governance, Thomas Bakewell, and fundraising guru Carol Weisman to help educate boards on the latest industry trends. The Boardroom webinar series will focus on different topics each month through the end of 2015. I wanted to mention really quickly that BoardPack is a secure, affordable, and easy-to-use paperless board meeting solution. Users can access materials from the native iPad app or through a web browser on other devices. Private annotations, minutes builder, and unlimited document storage are a few highlights of what we have to offer. Before we jump into today's topic, let me tell you a little bit about today's speakers. Thomas Bakewell works to bring out the best your team has to offer. He is the author of the book, Claiming Your Place at the Boardroom Table. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Bakewell has advised and directed CEOs and presidents of large for-profit and nonprofit corporations. His vast board experience has made him a leader and go-to source in board governance. Carol Weisman, president of Board Builders, is an internationally known speaker, author, trainer, and consultant. Carol specializes in volunteerism, fundraising, and governance. Carol won a Telly Award for her PBS special, Building a Board with a Passion for Mission. Her board experience is vast, having served on 38 boards and served as president of 7. Carol and Tom, take it away.
Well, Tom, the most exciting governance issues in the world today
is
policies and procedures.
All right, listen. Don't be cheeky like that. Policies and procedures
tell me why they're
are
important.
Listen.
First, what are they?
Well, policy and procedures, as you see here on the screen, are just real simple statements of how your organization intends to conduct its services, actions, or business. Now, I say simple. Some people can get busy and have pages and manuals and hundreds of pages, but policies and procedures are basically simple statements of how we handle our business and how to handle situations that come up, so you think them through before you get into a problem, and they help guide how the organization. We've got a definition here also of procedures, and they basically describe how each procedure or each policy will be put into action. You know, what are we going to do, what steps, and which forms or documents.
Great.
So that's a mouthful.
And tell me how they're different from some of these other things we hear about bylaws, and what's the difference between a bylaw and a...
Sure. Let's just go through a couple related concepts, and at times these can get a little confusing and all, and you maybe have to call up the good lawyer or go to the books or whatever, but just as an overview, you know, again, the policies and procedures, they're basically the overview. The policies are the overview of how we're going to handle things, and the procedures are the details. But there are starting points. Every organization, almost every corporation has a type of bylaws or articles. Those are usually filed with the state, some state of incorporation, and they're governing rules. And those need to comport. They don't always do, but they are supposed to comport with the laws of the state of the jurisdiction. And they're governing rules that are how the company is supposed to operate, how the association, how the teachers association, how the major public company is supposed to operate, etc. And it also controls the actions of its members or the stockholders, etc. Then you have guidelines, and those can be just rules or instructions. You could argue that guidelines are policies or procedures. So we'll go through today 2 examples of great guidelines. One is for a major public company, General Motors, that's been working on kind of their overarching governance guidelines forever. Then one I'll bring up from independent sector and board source that shows some good checklist of guidelines for not-for-profits. And guidelines also, another word you hear related to guidelines is best practices, the concept of best practices. It may not be required by law, but a lot of the good governance today is focused on what is a best practice. Okay? Standard operating procedures, again, there you go, procedures. It's just a method by which we do things. Of course, everybody hears this term from the military so many times. What are our, they have so many slang terms. What are our operating procedures, and how will they be applied? The principles are the more fundamental issues. What's the moral or the rule? A lot of people have visions, statements, or mission statements or principles about how we're going to operate our business. and they can be very important. Today we'll touch on the case of Volkswagen that's in the press right now, where they're having a major challenge in the firm. Another company that comes to mind in the food industry is Chipotle. They've got issues right now. Well, what do those have to do with policies and procedures and principles, ethics and all? We'll talk about that a little bit today. And then law, of course, everybody says the law says, a rule made by the government of a town, county, state, etc. So,
why have policies and procedures?
Because you hope they bring structure to the organization and they can help you deal with problems. Look, you've been around the block. You've worked with lots of corporations. I do public and not-for-profit, private. You do a lot of not-for-profit. I'll bet if I said to you, Carol, give me an example right now of an organization that you know that's got a little bit of a twist or a little bit of a problem about a procedure or a policy, come up with one.
I'll give you one right now because I've seen it work two ways. One, this is the CEO has been very ill. He's been off for 4 months, and he's receiving his full salary. The policy manual says after 8 weeks, you have to go on disability.
So you hope they have either a disability policy or maybe some kind of state-funded disability or something.
Yes, but he's getting his full salary.
Yep.
And other people in the organization who had similar or different illnesses had to go on disability after 8 weeks. And when he comes back, there's going to be a real morale problem.
Going to be a firestorm. Okay, so you're giving an example there. Now, I could tweak that and poke on that, but that's a good example. So a CEO is being treated differently than people. And oftentimes, you actually have contracts where the CEO does have a special privilege like that or whatever, but obviously that may not be the case here.
That's not the case here. And let me give you another example of where they had policies and procedures, and it worked out quite differently. Mm-hmm. The policy and procedure, similar kind of thing. After 8 weeks, you have to go on disability.
Right.
And this was a woman who was much beloved by her coworkers. She had cancer, and her coworkers got together and gave up their vacation time. Mm-hmm. And so that was in the policies and procedures that you could do that. And unfortunately, it didn't have a good ending. So, she passed away. But the entire organization pulled together, and at the end of this, there was great rapport, and people felt very good about themselves.
So you're having set rules that you think through things, but there's always going to be an exception where there's something not covered. I remember my early days as the chief financial officer of a hospital. I was in my 20s, and there was an employee. It was a healthcare facility, and her diamond ring had gotten crushed on the job. And she was looking for reimbursement, and I read, the insurance guy said, "Hey, it's not covered," yada yada, yada yada. Well, young single stupid guy, never been married, didn't understand what this meant, and this was a bad choice on my part to say, "I'm sorry, we can't reimburse this."
Sure.
Trying to show who was in charge, and I learned pretty quickly where that was a bad idea.
Yeah.
So you try and cover everything you can in policies and procedures,
and you never can. You also have to have good leadership.
Yeah, and then you get to we saw earlier the issue of principles, and you and I'll tell another quick story. You and I have a dear friend of ours who's a rock star college president. He's gone from the corporate world to the college presidency, and we'll leave it at that. And he is the master of really having great standards and holding ourselves to high standards, etc. And he was busy as a cat, and he was running to a meeting one day on the campus, and he couldn't find a parking spot, so he parked in the handicap spot. Well, you know what happened in about 30 seconds. Some student got a photo of it. It's up on Facebook.
Oh.
and he was a stand-up guy. He owned it.
He is a stand-up guy.
Yeah. I'm going to tell you one other story about that, and then we'll get on here. But I was talking with a CEO of a major construction company, and he's getting ready to retire. And one of his policies, this isn't a written policy, one of his, the way he does business, he would meet every week over lunch with all the new engineers. This is a major company. They'd fly in all the engineers from worldwide in their first week or two of work, and he'd have lunch every week with them and talk about our ethics and our policies and procedures. And as much as he tried to do that, there was a story that came down about him that really helped prove the point. So this was a very important executive, and he's running late to a meeting one day. And he came in, and he was 30 minutes late. And it's a big customer call and all that and everything else. And he could have easily just said, "I'm here." And he came in and said, "Hey, I can make all kinds of excuses." but I screwed up and I'm late. And that story became legend in the company about this is a straight stand-up guy that tells the truth. So you own it. So we have policy. They serve as internal controls. Some of them are required by law. Let me give you one here that's required by law, and you're going to know this one, Carol. So you work with tons of not-for-profits, so do I. A lot of times people have great ideas. Sometimes even it's a for-profit that wants to do a charitable event. Let's go fundraise.
Yes.
Hey, when you start fundraising across state lines, is there anything you're supposed to do?
Yes.
What are you supposed to do?
It's not count the money. It's register in every state where you are fundraising.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's like the bingo games and everything else. The moment, you have a good idea we're doing a charitable thing, but the moment you're supposed to go across state lines, most states require that you register with the Attorney General's office so that people aren't out running scams.
And it's an expensive process, and there are companies that do it for you.
Yeah.
But if you don't do it, it's to your peril.
Absolutely. So you have a relationship of policies and procedures. Now, again, you can try and get to the relationship of the policies and procedures. For each, you have clearly defined policy, and there needs to be a written communication policy, and how to apply the policy, how it's enforced, and who it affects. These are kind of detail, blah, 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 but it's kind of important. And then if you have an employee review the policy, a procedure should be available to explain the necessary steps. So a lot of times you might have a policy, and there's always the catch-22. There's always the question that arises. And I've seen many a time in organizations, the astounding thing about employees is they're so smart. You come up with a policy. If there's an angle, a loophole, they will figure it out. So
well, and also I think the other thing that's confusing to employees is when people make exceptions for special cases and are not told why.
Yeah.
And they shouldn't be told,
right.
But it gets confusing. And I remember a hospital where none of the doctors could take vacation, the teaching staff, in July because the residents killed too many people.
Oh my! Well, were you getting
interns and residents were brand new, and so they couldn't take vacation in July.
Yeah.
But every year, somebody wound up taking vacation, and it was usually something very specific, like having to fly back to Australia for a family wedding or whatever, and everybody. And sometimes it was an illness of a parent. And it's not up to the boss to share that, but it wasn't in the policies and procedures except for special family emergencies. And so people were very unhappy about it.
Okay. And of course, training and education is vitally important to policies and procedures. How do you use them? How do you apply them? What do they get used? And, policies and procedures are only useful if the staff understands them and knows about them. And this is I give you the funny story here now. So one of the issues, whether you're a not-for-profit, we're going to get on to some of the legal things that have showed up in the past decade, but Sarbanes Oxley has been one. There's big questions about whether it applies to not-for-profits or for-profits and all. But Sarbanes Oxley, one of the requirements is for all corporations, you have whistleblower laws. Well, for decades, corporations have had whistleblower laws, but in most corporations, the phone sat on the CEO's secretary's desk for years, and who really believed that when they did a whistleblower call, anything was going to happen to it objectively? And a lot of people didn't. So, it's about training and education. And now people tend to know whistleblower lines tend to go straight to the board of directors or outside parties, outside companies that are totally independent and will carefully review what's going on here. So,
and this has certainly been an issue in the military.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, you get different types of organizations. If you're a medical center, as you were talking about, you got to have much more high-level, detailed training on policies and procedures, even the basic things. I remember my first job in a healthcare facility was, this is how you wash your hands.
Yes.
This is how you put a patient in a wheelchair. This is how you take a patient out of a wheelchair. And it was 2 or 3 days of really superb, detailed, excellent training. So.
And the other thing is that it's not a one-shot deal.
Right.
It's more like exercise than vaccination.
Yeah.
You have to do it regularly. And things come up unfortunately, things like Ebola,
right,
where it's a totally new game when you're dealing with the Ebola virus. And so you have to train everyone. And then the next month, especially if you're fortunate enough not to have had an Ebola patient, you have to train again.
Yep.
And so this is an ongoing process that's part of...
You learn as you go. And on this last bullet point here, I want to emphasize, so the second one is, first one, educate staff. Second, update when that needs to happen, which is important. But the third one's the most important in my mind. And again, this is where I like to have, skinnier policies than the detailed ones. But you got to make sure the staff knows the importance of those policies and procedures. Our story about the college president, you can lecture people 1,000 times, but you do one thing like that wrong, and that's what people remember and all. And so it's very important that people know policies and procedures are vitally important. And the more they're known about and understood, the more serious people will be about them.
So tell me about, you mentioned Sarbanes Oxley.
Right.
For people who don't know what Sarbanes Oxley is, what is it? And who's Sarbanes and who's Oxley?
Well, they were a couple congressmen, I suspect, and some people would say they're rascals. Some people would say they're the best
They're
things.
saints.
Saints, yeah, exactly. Saints and sinners. I hang with both of them. But it was laws that came out in the early 2000s, some say in response to a lot of the financial crisis that was going on at the time. We had Enron, a train wreck with a major public company, and some other scandals. And these were rules to keep the major corporations in line. And it established a number of requirements that affect corporate governance. Also you see another long name there that the general public doesn't know too much about, but the accounting world has become vitally interested in, good or bad. It's called the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, PCAOB, and they regulate the auditors. And if we were having a talk about what's really changed in the governance world, one of the handful of changes that has occurred in the governance world in the past decade, past 15 years, is people would argue that even on companies that were being audited, the auditors really reported to management. So you have to wonder whether management, really has a lot of say there and a power. And the answer is they really did. Today, the auditors report exclusively and directly to the audit committee, which is made up, hopefully, of independent board members. On a public company, all the board members who are on audit committees have to be independent board members, and a large number of them have to be financially literate. So the implication and the point of that is it's a much more independent process, the audit process, and that's regulated by this organization called Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. So.
And I think this is important in nonprofits because one of the things that we see, and this is out of generosity, is many accounting firms, if they have a board member, will donate a free audit, but they will send in a 12-year-old to do it and not review it. So sometimes it's somebody's first audit, and it's pro bono, so who really cares? And then you've got this organization that oversees the audit, which has never been reviewed.
Right. So hopefully it keeps it up. Now, the example you just gave, that can, look, you can have bad audits anywhere. This is designed to get the industry to kick it up a notch. It tries to talk about other things. Should you have rotating auditors, and should you be able to keep the same firm for more than 5 years, or the same partner, and those kinds of things. I lived the experience of what you just talked about. I was hired by a college to come in and look at that was having a financial crisis. There was a new young president. And the board could not believe, because they were audited every year by one of the big four accounting firms, I'll leave the name out of it, they could not believe that what I was saying was right. And basically the story was this organization had negative cash flow for a decade, and they were broke. They didn't have, when the cash goes is when you hit the wall. When do organizations change or deal with the problem? They were totally out of cash, and no bank would loan them any more money. And they were saying this can't be possible. We've had clean audits from the big auditing firm, and they come in every year and they say, you got a strong balance sheet and all. Well, what had happened, and before you throw me out, just do one thing. Just bring your audit partner in here and let's talk to him. Well, they brought in the audit partner. It was not the audit partner that had just handled the engagement. It was the audit partner that had been on the engagement for 15 years. And what had happened is he had rotated off according to the rules, and they brought in a new young audit partner. And she was not savvy in this industry and could not pick this up. On top of which, this guy knew exactly. He sat there and looked at his shoes. He said, yeah, nope, Tom's right. I've known for years, and we've hoped that it was going to get better, and the management kept saying it was going to get better, and we've got, just around the corner is a solution, and there wasn't. And so, I got the job, and the audit firm continued. They're a good, high-quality audit firm, but just it's how you understand a policy and procedure. So another couple guys died. Frank, also, again, this was even more current with the current crisis. And again, they created another major organization that's going to impact a lot of people. It's called the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Just in October of this year, we've had major law changes in the real estate industry about mortgages and mortgage lending. It used to be on everyday people doing a real estate deal and buying a home. You could make all kinds of changes right up to the last minute, back and forth negotiation and everything, and the agents would always pull their hair out. Well, the laws now say you can't make any changes within the last 30 days of a deal, or else you kind of got to go totally back to underwriting and everything else. And the theory is it's supposed to help the consumer. We'll see how that plays out.
What does say on pay mean?
Well, that's not one that's getting too much details. That primarily has to do with public companies. And, there's been an outcry and an outrage, or good, bad, whichever side you're on, about the pay of senior executives. It used to be the average pay of a public company CEO was 20 times the average worker, and now it's 200 to 250 times. And say on pay is that stockholders are supposed to be able to vote and have a say. At this point, all it really is an advisory or give us our opinion. There's no real power behind it. So that's say on pay.
Got it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the policies and procedures required by law.
Yeah, so there are a lot of those. The most common one that not-for-profits are dealing with right now is Form 990. That's it's a tax filing that if you're tax exempt, you have to, not every not-for-profit, but the vast majority of not-for-profits have to file what's called the 990. And it used to be a page long with a little detailed information, and now it's 30, 40, 50 pages long, and it's got a checklist of a lot of key questions. Are your board members independent? Are your board members paid? Who are your board members? Is there a conflict of interest policy? How's the policy applied? And these are being utilized. Some people would say it's a burden. Some people would say it's a great thing. So and then you get to the question, here's a trivia question. Do you have to make your 990 public? It's a question for you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the easiest place to find it is GuideStar. And what's interesting about GuideStar is they're under .com and .org.
Yeah. So you're going into some minutiae about the not-for-profit world, but let's talk on it. So the 990 is an annual form. Carol brought up an organization called GuideStar. I believe it's a not-for-profit itself.
But they have a .com and
.com, to make it easy to find. And what they have is financial data that's easily available on all not-for-profits. What they do is they go to the feds and they get this data that's required to be filed. And now the downside of them is they're usually 2 or 3 years behind.
Yes.
And so, but you can go see what the top executives are being paid, et cetera. So it's a good place. But in terms of policies and procedures, you're required. Now, one other distinction here on the 990. So back to the question, must you share it with the public? The best practice is that a not-for-profit, I believe the best practice is, let's get your opinion too, is a not-for-profit should put their financial statements and their 990 publicly on their website. That's a high standard and best practice. Not legally required, but I think a best practice. Do you think it's a best practice?
Yeah, and if I'm a sophisticated donor, I want to know that.
Yeah, you bet. So people can argue we don't want that. We don't want the CEO's salary to be known and those kinds of things, but I say it's good. Now, so a question is trivia, just one more little bit on a 990. If you don't make it public, and I mean, literally, I've got a client right now that has supported a charity for years, and it's a school, and that school has had some problems with debt, and the donor is looking at their year in charitable giving, and they're really questioning whether they want to give to this organization or not, because they don't trust the numbers at that point, or they haven't seen it. And I know the people on that board, and I'm inclined to say, hey, look, I got this client that wants to give you the money. Can you give me some 990? And I know what they're going to say. They're going to say, well, have the donor come see us. And, the donor doesn't have anything to do with that.
No.
I'm trying to do them a favor. So a last trivia question on 990, must you share the financial audits as well? I believe, again, the argument can be made that the charity should share the audits, but some people would say, no, we only need to share the 990, which includes a summary financial statement. So 10K, now we're getting to the big public companies. Those are available. You can find that data publicly. Publicly means our financial records are available. It's not easy to find it, but it's not terribly difficult if you know where you're going to look. And then we have banks up there, and banks have just a myriad of reporting and lending standards that are often in the press today because of the high standards.
What about public companies? How are they different?
Well, again, they have to do, not only are they public, of course it means they've issued public stock or public debt, but they also have to operate very much in the public eye. And again, these laws we mentioned, Sarbanes Oxley and Dodd-Frank, have kicked way up the requirements of what public companies have to do in terms of reporting. And you can go to their websites of any public company. They're required now to have at least 3 key committees. Those committees have to have their charters online. They have to list who's on those committees.
What is a charter of a committee?
Yeah, so a charter is great. It's a, some people would say, well, it's a bylaw or it's an operating policy or procedure of what the committee is supposed to do.
What their charge is.
Yeah, so what's your charge is? So the audit committee is that we're supposed to oversee the audits of the organization. We're supposed to hire the auditors, and some of them can be a page of bullet points. Some of them can be 20 or 30 pages long. What committee is responsible for strategy, how we handle strategy, who's the key executive, who do we hire and fire, etc. So a nominating and governance committee normally would be our primary roles to hire and fire the CEO, etc. So good question. And you can have all kinds of committees. You can have, again, public companies have to have basically at least 3 committees that mention there, the audit, the nom-gov, and they usually have to have 1 or 2 other required committees as well. And then here's what else you'll find on those public websites of public companies: codes of conducts, governance charters, the comp charters, the audit committee, the related financial party transactions, and codes of ethics, and on and on. A lot of great, any good public company, just pull it up and you can see all about detailed charters.
So, sample committees for different organizations. Obviously, it's going to be different if you're a large public company versus a large university or hospital.
Yeah, so we talked about large public companies, and so here a typical private company, and these, private company can be from mom and pop outfit to, a major, not for large private companies like REI, the great outdoors company, and most people are surprised. Mars is a private company. You get companies with billions and billions of dollars of revenue, and they're private companies. Some of them have no committee. Some of them, typically, they have an executive committee or a nom and gov, a comp, and an audit and finance. Usually you find those basic committees. Okay?
Tell our folks what
nominating and governance. They
okay.
tend to be who oversees who's going to be on the board, who we're going to hire to be our directors or our board members, and they usually tend to handle, sometimes you have a separate comp committee, but they tend to handle compensation and those matters. And one last thing I'll say, one of my favorite sayings that I've learned this year on governance, of course, strategies is as serious as a heart attack, and great strategy starts in the nominating and governance committee.
It's like our Supreme Court.
Absolutely. You get the right people in, it makes a difference. Okay. Large charities, they tend to have audit and finance committees, comp, governance, member and social impact committees, and nominating subcommittees.
Great.
And here's an example. This is being a little cheeky here. This is an organization. The largest number of committees I've ever seen for an organization was 14, but it was...
Oh, I had one with 32.
Oh, come on, 32. Tell me more. Come on.
It was ridiculous.
Yeah.
It had a committee. This was insane. They had a committee for the Christmas party. I mean, in the bylaws.
Yep. A committee for the Christmas party.
Yes.
Okay.
It was the nuttiest thing I've ever seen. And they were very proud because they said this way, their thinking was, this way everybody can be involved.
Yeah.
So they can be in one of these 32 committees.
Oh, my.
I thought this was...
This is not a good solution. Well,
That's a committee I would have chosen.
Yeah. Well, I can channel my early days watching the movie Princess Bride. Inconceivable.
Yes.
Okay. So here's the example what this committee had. And again, very, very large medical center, very important. And, large medical provider. audit committees, comp committees, conflict of interest. I mean, just on and on and on. Governance committee, etc. And you can, one of the great things about the BoardPack tool is you can have unlimited committees. So we're being sponsored today by BoardPack. And one of the great things about BoardPack is they have an easy way to use it. And
so if Carol
wants 40 or 50
committees,
committees, or if you want 2 or 3 of them. But again, it's one of the great things. And it's a great place to have your policies and procedures easily available to where the employees can get to them, or any number of people you want to get to the policies and procedures.
And what I love about BoardPack and the policy and procedure issue is that if you're in the boardroom and you have a screen, you can pull it up in 1 second.
Right.
You don't have to go back someplace, plow through paper, try and find it. Yeah. And you can quickly address it, and it shouldn't be on your board. Necessarily be on your website.
Absolutely. So you get into a question here of what kind of policies does your organization need? Well, it really depends on the type of the company. You have to think this through. Of course, most people, you start with your historical data, and then are you a for-profit company? Are you public? If you're public, your standard goes through the roof.
Way up.
If you're a private company, do you want the policies or not? I mentioned here the cutoff on 50 employees. There's kind of a rule in terms of companies that the moment you go over 50 employees, things like Obamacare, the rules change instantly as soon as you're over 50 employees and over. So lots of different rules: the size of your revenue, your industry, and your values. So just to give an example or two on that fine point of what kind of policies, really I like to say from minutes to manufacturing to margin, how will the policies and procedures differ? Well, they differ, again, if you're a mom and pop retail store, a McDonald's or a major medical center here. What do you need for a mom and pop retail store? Well, you probably need some payroll rules about when you clock in or when you don't clock in. You need some rules about protecting the inventory and those kinds of things.
But some of the rules are very interesting, because if you have a mom and pop store and truly just 2 employees, mom and dad, a couple, you have to have signs in the bathroom that says if you're handling food, even if it's 1 bathroom and it's 2 people, you have to obey the laws.
Yeah. So now you're getting into the issue of law versus policies and procedures, and let's just go down this path.
But your policy has to be to follow the law.
They're supposed to be congruent. So we have the example here of McDonald's. My only point here was going to be, I can only imagine what the training manual for a McDonald's looks like if you go to McDonald's Hamburger University to learn how to make a hamburger. But let's go to this other example that we touched on that you keep up on. So what's going on with Chipotle right now?
Well, Chipotle's having a rough time because they've wanted to do a very good thing and buy locally.
So they're following the trend of sourcing food locally. A lot of schools are starting to do that, et cetera. Mm-hmm.
That's their policy.
The theory is it's high quality food, and it supports the local economy.
And there's less money spent on fossil fuel to transport it.
So it's good for
So that's the policy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what's the problem?
It broke down with procedure.
Okay.
And they didn't quality control the way they should have. And that's why you wound up with a huge problem with it. I believe it was salmonella, wasn't it?
Some kind of
mess.
Foodborne disease. So the question, the point being, if they're buying their green beans or something, or whatever the food source.
You haven't been to Chipotle.
I know. You could probably get green beans there. What do you? Okay, green sauce. Come on, taco sauce.
I'll cut you a break.
The point being, if you're producing something in a major manufacturing center, you're going to have very, very high standards.
And you need to do that regardless of your policy, your procedures have to stay the same.
All right, I stand corrected. It won't be the first time you pop me a good one. So, and major medical center, again, we can only imagine what, and the story that I think of that's been in the news, you may not have picked much on this, but on the major medical centers, where they've had, problems with infection control and those types of things, what they find out almost inevitably when they get a medical center that's having bad outcomes, it's the really basics that people are forgetting. The surgeons are forgetting this. They're getting too busy to wash their hands. And who wants to wash their hands 100 times a day? Yeah.
Well, and also it can be the people in the room are flinching, but it also can be not at the top of the food chain, but the people who are cleaning the ORs between use need to know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, now I'm going to say one last story here. My dad was a disabled veteran, so it's close to home, and, they had and we know what's been going on with the Veterans Administration for years, and there was a outrage here in St. Louis not too long ago because one of the dental clinics, they had an enormous rate of infections, and basically they found out that one of the employees was not bothering to clean any of the tools.
Yeah, exactly.
And it breaks your heart, but policies and procedures are important. So.
Absolutely.
And the punchline on that story is there needs to be consequences for bad behavior.
Well, but also it's life and death issues.
It can be. So another thing, another policy and procedures is, do we have policies and procedures regarding hiring board members? Do we have, orientation manuals for new board members? So here's a question here. What to ask before joining a board? What do you want to know before you get on a board? How many have you been on? 32?
38.
Oh, you overachiever, you.
Yeah, right. I think it's a sign of mental illness.
Well, the one I liked the best was the gangs. But
yeah, well.
Do they really have boards?
No, I started my professional career working with street gangs, and I found they were extremely well organized. They had a clear leadership training program. They told you what to wear, what was the path to leadership. Yep. They were very clear.
But they were just a little light on the policies and procedures.
No, they were clear on policies
and
procedure. They just were not. Part of it was not obeying the law. That was where there was a problem.
Okay, so what are some of the things you look for before you join a board?
Well, I really want to understand the mission, and I want to find out where they are in their cycles. So if it's a new organization, they may, and you're the king of turnarounds, so they may be in trouble, in which case you would be a great person.
Or they may need a fundraiser, in which case you would be good.
But I want to know, how evolved are they? Are they clear? Do they have a mission, a strategy? Some of them don't, especially the younger ones.
Right.
What are people thinking of them in the marketplace? The one thing we hear all the time in nonprofits, we're the best kept secret.
Yeah.
I hate that one.
And that's fingernails on the blackboard, because if you're a best kept secret, there's a reason.
Oh yeah.
You're not getting your story out.
Is there someone in town doing it better, or somewhere around the world?
Yep.
And the biggest question I have is not how much I'm going to get paid.
Yep.
It's how much do you expect me to give as a donor?
Yep.
So I joined one board, and I asked the wrong question because I'm a mathematical idiot.
Yeah.
I said, "What's the average donation?" And they said $45,000.
Yeah.
And I said, "Oh, nice seeing you."
Yeah.
And I was on my way out the door. And, well, it turns out they had one person who gave $1 million a year.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then most people gave between $500 and $5,000.
Yeah, no, I've got the exact same thing. Put a bow on this one, but I've got a charity again. It's a school, and there's a board member. There's some issues going on. They're questioning the finances. There's a board member. Okay, they got a new CEO. He's not doing a good job of raising money, so he's trying to, appropriately so, trying to implement a new policy. All board members must give. They haven't had this policy. Well, he's pushing one of their better board members, who's kind of the outside different drummer. What he doesn't know is this board member, because he's not in the details, this board member has really sacrificed to give an enormous sum of money in the prior couple of years. And he's kind of done. He's done all his work.
Yep.
He's given an enormous amount of time. He's finishing out his term, but he's not about to meet that new minimum requirement. Well, there's no policy and procedure on it.
Sure.
And I said, if you had a policy and procedure on that, then you're expected to make a gift with equal to your capacity, or a minimum gift of $500. Sure. There's an example of where a policy could really help.
So you are such a big fan of General Motors and what they're doing. Tell us about why you so admire
Well, of course,
their
they've
work.
been in the soup up and down financially and otherwise, but they have been working on good governance guidelines for almost 30 years now. And so anybody here can Google up corporate governance guidelines for GM, and they will find a terrific checklist. You could think of it as a best practice example checklist. But it's got great 30-plus guidelines. You could argue their policies. You could argue their procedures. They call them guidelines. And here's the categories. The first one is the board mission and responsibilities. Then it talks about the selection and composition of board members. Then it talks about board functioning. Then it talks about board relationships to management. Very important to understand that, because you always get into this issue of micromanagement versus not. Then they talk about meeting procedures, when we're going to meet. Then they talk about committee matters and leadership development. So very buttoned down. And then the other one I mentioned, that's such a fabulous checklist as well if you're in the not-for-profit world. And again, this is available for free. You can find it on the independent sector website. Lucy's been there for years. You want to get the principals workbook. I mentioned they have a principals book. That's good. The workbook's spectacular because they're not-for-profit. They have 4 categories. The other one we just mentioned, GM, had 7. They have 4. Legal compliance and public disclosure, so it gets into conflicts, whistleblowers, document retention. It gets into effective governance. It gets into a 3rd category of strong financial oversight, which is my sweet spot, as you know. And then it gets into responsible fundraising. Just one more example here. So you see travel and expense policy. So one of the major blue chip accounting firms, again, I'll leave their name out of it because it's my alma mater and they're really terrific people. They had a policy that got them in trouble, believe it or not. Their policy was they would try and package up their booking through major agencies. Sure. They would charge clients full price for travel. And guess what they were doing? Other than that, though, with the back door of the travel agency, when they would get the discounts, they would not pass it along. It was a chance for them to save money.
Sure.
Ethics issue.
Sure.
Somebody found out about that. And interestingly, when they started to investigate it, they found memos in the files where some of the partners had objected to this. We're not being honest with our clients. We're taking advantage of them. You need to be upfront with them and tell them about it. If we're discounting it, they need to know. Very interesting. So they cleaned it up fine, and they took good care of it. So let me also mention policies and procedures. Now, you know a really great source. Tell me about BoardSource. Yeah.
BoardSource has a great CD-ROM, and it's $65, I think.
Best money you will ever spend. What's it got on it?
Absolutely. And it's got 3 samples of policies, and I use it all the time. I was actually one of the consultants that worked on it. And so for a large organization, medium-sized and very small, so it's so much easier to edit than to correct.
And why reinvent the wheel?
Absolutely.
Yep.
So it's a great wheel,
Yep.
and I think it's an incredibly worthwhile investment.
One of the most painful experiences I've ever had in my life was hired by a charity to help them get fundraising going. Interesting. It was a very successful charity, but they had a good revenue base, but they had never fundraised. And so they wanted to fundraise from scratch. Well, they were a very compliant-oriented organization, so they were big on not big on fundraising, but big on policies and procedures. Kind of had something to do with their faith background, but we won't touch that. And we just went round and round on these policies for so long. I just wanted to pull my hair out and lose my mind. But we got to a good place. We ended up actually, believe it or not, raising some money. So.
And here are some
so
policies.
This is the organization. Here's what we came up with. We came up with fundraising philosophy, board member fundraising. We talked about that. We talked about, believe it or not, you got to have very precise gift acknowledgement policies. You got to have gift acceptance policies, gift in kind policy. That's where if somebody gives you a piece of real estate, or if somebody gives you, I've had people walk in the door, here's some artwork. I'd like a $10,000 deduction. Well, maybe it might be worth $10,000, but it might be worth,
who pays?
It's like at the auction.
Well, but also in the policy, it has to say
Who
an
pays?
appraisal.
Exactly.
Appraisal is
Yep.
10% the value of the artwork.
Yeah, the most offended I've ever been with a charity, and it's a place I had supported big for a long time, was they took a gift that I made them of stock, and they charged the trading brokerage fees against me.
Bad policy.
Yeah, bad policy. The stockbrokers call me up and say, hey, I need you to send a check of $125 over. I said, well, why? What for? Well, we traded your stock, and the charity's policy is that you have to pay for it. Last gift they ever got.
Because you had a different policy.
Yeah, I had a different policy. You give them somebody a large sum of money, and I don't want
And they're nickel and diming you.
They're nickel and diming and being
Yeah.
greedy. That's how it came across. Next line. Another examples of policies and procedures, confidentiality. Again, we talked about gift in kind, pledge forms, donors. So you can just go on and on with details. Great organizations have simple and really good
Another
policies.
great resource for this is the Association of Fundraising Professionals.
They're a great organization. Here's other common policies that people have to deal with. Volunteers. Hospitals have volunteers come in the organization. My young daughter called. She's coming home from college. She wants to take a gift of toys down to the children's hospital. they're going to have a policy and procedure on how that gets handled.
Absolutely.
Confidentiality, date protection, data protection is a better way to say it, environmental, IT, equality and diversity, complaints, on and on and on. So, how about meetings, attendance, and procedures? Carol, what can you tell us about that?
You absolutely have to have very clear policies about how often you come, what happens if you don't come. And the other thing that's interesting is that in some states, the states have not caught up with technology. So some states, it is not legal to vote by email.
Or to have phone conferences.
Right.
So a lot of organizations find themselves, a classic example, well, we got a great idea, let's have a policy, or it says we can do it, but the state laws say they can't if they haven't
And
kept up.
boo-hoo, you lose.
Gotcha. Oh, wait. All right. So then we've got Robert's Rules of Orders. Everybody's heard of them. We're not touching those today, but they're primarily used in large group settings. They're very precise rules about how voting and who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak, etc. So if you're into Robert's Rules, have at it. And that, my friend Carol, brings us to the end of a season kicking off here, and the end of another program on policies and procedures.
Wonderful world of policies and procedures.
All right. Well, we did the best we could, and it's great to see you, and we wish everybody well here. And anybody care to reach out, they can. And if they really want to get a leg up on managing policies and procedures, check out BoardPack. It's a great tool.
Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you again to Tom and Carol for your wonderful insight today. If you have any questions or comments for today's speakers, their contact information is on the screen. If you have interest in learning more about BoardPack, please send us an email, sales@boardpack.com.